Whilst I've always been skeptical and evidence-based, I've never been able to shake this experience. My mother and her sisters have all had what may be termed as paranormal experiences, but without my personal experience, I had only thought of them as intriguing stories. As I take after my mom, though, I'm male. It's possible that they may have a perception which I share. This might be relevant later. In the mid-1990s, when I was around 21, I moved into the top floor of a 3-story building in Birmingham, Edgbaston, UK, which had been converted into flats. Mine had its own small landing and separate bedroom and lounge/kitchen. I also had 2 kittens, who play their own role in this. Having previously shared a house with friends and being young, this was my first time by myself, which may explain the feeling. But it was a very tranquil place. With the exception of my current house, it was the most peaceful place I've lived in. Again, this may be relevant later. Nothing of any real pertinence happened for the majority of the time I lived there, but I would often be listening to music for hours with my eyes closed, absorbing every note, frequently Nick Drake, whom I had recently discovered, and felt as though someone was sitting there listening with me. I didn't pay too much attention to this, with my very scientific background and all, but the sensation was as though someone was sitting right next to you and you closed your eyes. You would know or sense that they were there. It's hard to explain, but it somehow felt nice and I got used to it, putting it down to my own imagination though. Fairly often, the 2 kittens would be playing in the lounge and both suddenly stop and stare at the same spot on the wall, then follow something around the room together. Again, I thought nothing of it for a while, but then realized that there was never an insect or reflection which they could have been looking at. Eventually, with the frequency of this combined with the feeling of a presence, whenever I saw them doing it, I would tell them to quote-unquote stop watching the ghost, although of course the tone in which I was using was very much tongue-in-cheek. Another curiosity with them was that they would refuse to enter the bedroom, or quickly leave if carried in there. It was something else I didn't pay attention to until much later. I had lived there for about a year and a half and decided that I would save some money and share a house with someone that I knew. When I told the landlord, he commented that of all his properties, this one was very much an outlier in that no one apart from me had ever stayed there more than a few weeks or a couple months, and that I had been there 18 to 24 months. So, a few weeks before moving out, the first noticeable thing happened. At the foot of my bed is an outside wall with a small window to the left. As I lay down in bed one night, the only light was moonlight and a distant street lamp. I closed my eyes and realized that although dark, I could still see the room around me. I thought my eyes must be open, so I scrunched them shut to be sure. It sounds odd, I know, but I could still see, and was definitely not asleep. I was both marveling at and trying to understand whatever craziness this was when I had what I could only describe as an out-of-body experience. I began floating up toward the ceiling, stopping at a few feet away, and then floated toward the foot of the bed and outside wall. Admittedly, I was now in a panic as I didn't know what was happening, but the overriding fear was floating through the wall and not returning, so I tried to shake myself back down somehow. I then had that falling sensation that you get in dreams, and the jolt when you wake up. Despite feeling like I was awake the entire time, I put it down to having fallen asleep immediately and going straight into a dream. A week later, and my final week at the flat, I went to bed one night. I closed my eyes and again could see the room around me. As I looked around again with my eyes closed, I was first excited at being able to repeat this, but then remembered the out-of-body experience. That worried me, so I opened my eyes so that it might not happen again, but also to know for certain that I was awake. As I looked across to the diagonally opposite corner of the room where the window was, I looked slightly left at the standalone wardrobe and saw the image of a young woman standing there about 12 feet away, staring at me. Her image was formed by misty white and dark shadow, and I saw that she had long, straight, shiny hair as a standout feature. And no, this is way before the original Ring films. I can imagine what some people might think. Of course, it scared the living crap out of me. I tried to put it down to tired eyes and the moonlight making the shape, but then she slowly made her way to the bed and, as best as I could make out, leaned over as if she were about to kiss me goodnight. With all my bravery and rational thinking, I pulled the covers over my head, scared out of my mind, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, and I don't know how long I laid there waiting, but I eventually went to sleep. I thought that was it, and the next day put it down to an overactive imagination despite what I've shared above. I later moved out without telling anyone of this for fear of being labeled a crazy person. A few weeks later, I'm with my dad in his car one evening, and we drive past the house. We both look at it and notice the lounge light is on in the top floor window. He says it looks like someone has moved in already, to which I replied, thinking that he would just laugh and call me silly, "Yeah, either that or it's the ghost." To my surprise, he looks at me with a stern face and asks if I'm being serious. That worries me. He pulls the car over and says that it's really important, and he's deadly serious, to let him know if there's anything I should tell him. So I start relaying to him what I've said above, and he's obviously concerned. He asks me to describe her, and once I have, he replies, "Yep, that's her." I think I was more shocked at that moment than the night I actually saw her. He then tells me, "When I said where you had moved to, your nan wanted you to move out right away, but we didn't say anything to you as we didn't want to worry you. Your nan's next-door neighbor had a daughter, and she was murdered in that flat by someone she worked with one New Year's Eve." My nan's neighbors were roughly the same age, so this would have been the late 60s or early 70s. "You just described her exactly," he said. And the police said that when they found her, she had not long had a bath and had been strangled with her dressing gown belt. One thing they remarked upon was how long and shiny her hair was. Still gives me chills, but this wasn't the end of it. At this point, I still hadn't told anyone apart from close family about my experience. I was trying to avoid the loony label. I was in my early 40s and working at a company as a software tester. As I say, my mindset is technical and fact-oriented. A guy starts on my team, 10 years my senior, but we have the same interests and personality, and we get on great. We're still friends to this day. A horror movie had just come out, so we're talking about it, which leads to talk of other similar movies, and then he tells me about a scary experience he once had himself. He said that he was lying in bed one night, and suddenly had the sensation of being strangled. He said it was so vivid that he swore it was real, but opened his eyes and no one else was there. He lived by himself in a flat. I asked him where this was. Same area. I asked him the road, same road, house number, flat, same one. He'd lived there about 10 years prior to my stay in it. That was the first time that I then told someone else about what I had been through. If this was paranormal, did she show herself to me because of the links between our families? Is this why the flat was so peaceful for me and not previous tenants, if that was why they had moved? Could I see her because of some ability, however small, which does run in my family? Is this what the kittens could sense? I've had a few other separate experiences, and so is my family, but they're for another post. Despite that experience, I'm still skeptical. There are so many questions that I just can't wrap my head around. For example, how would a spirit have conscious thought or action? How do clothes become part of an apparition? Why do we have little, if any, hard evidence? At the same time, I have no other explanation for what happened other than it was a lot of weird coincidences. I understand that to many this is just someone else's story, but at the same time, there is still an unthinkable amount of secrets to the universe that humanity has yet to unlock. I work in a prison in the UK. I always like to work nights because you do 7 days on and 7 days off. While on nights, I got locked onto a wing with no keys. We have a sealed pouch with a cell key inside for emergencies, if someone is hanging and I need to cut them down, etc., that kind of thing. I'm in charge of looking after 200 plus prisoners. After a few busy hours answering cell bells and doing my checks on people who are essentially on suicide watch, the wing starts to settle down. The stories I'm including here are very small portions of things that have happened to me on night shifts. Story 1. One night I was doing my checks. I heard a loud bang coming from the ones landing outside the servery. When I went inside to investigate, there was a broom on the floor. When I reviewed the CCTV footage, you can clearly see the broom slowly being lifted away from the wall where it was resting, and then quickly getting thrown to the ground. We have the footage copied, and most of the people at work have seen it. We usually show it to new staff before they do their first night shift to freak them out. Story 2. One night we had someone overdose. I was working the week after all this happened, and the cell was locked off for the police investigation and was completely empty. At about 3:30 in the morning, the cell bell for that room was pressed. At first I didn't even know that this cell belonged to the guy that had died the previous week, but as soon as I looked into the empty cell, I realized, and just froze. It takes a lot to freak me out. But I didn't walk back on that part of the landing until roll count. Story 3. This one is more minor, but still equally as creepy. Things that happened just last week that prompted me to share this. While walking on the 3's landing, one of the showers on the 2's turned on by itself. The only way to turn it on is to press a button on the wall inside the shower. I went to investigate, and the showers were locked, and the lights inside were turned off. This was about 2:30 a.m. Approximately 30 minutes later, I was walking down the 2's landing and an office door slammed shut. I checked the landings for open windows, and they were all shut. Again, every time I hear a noise, I always investigate, and love anything creepy, but this sent shivers down my spine. My mother and 2 older brothers would visit my auntie and 3 cousins around Christmas. The whole family would get together too, uncles, aunties, you name it. Anyway, they lived up near Inverness, in Scotland, in a place called the Black Isle. It's actually in a place called Cromarty, but Inverness is more well known, so I'll say that. The Black Isle was said to be used back in the day as a place where witches would meet up on Halloween and perform rituals, animal sacrifices, that kind of thing. Whether or not that's true is something else entirely. I'll get on to the story now. We all rented out a holiday home just down the road from my cousin's house. It had multiple bedrooms in it, so it was perfect for a lot of guests. Me and one of my older brothers and his friend from Africa were all staying in one room. They were fast asleep. I, however, was not. I woke suddenly and didn't know why. I scanned the room with my bleary eyes. It was very dark, and I couldn't hear anything but the snores from my brother and his friend. The door to the room slowly opened with a creak, and I swear I froze with fear. I didn't see anything enter through it, but as I tried to scan my eyes around the room, I started to see shadow-like figures pulsating and hovering around the two adjacent beds, over my brother and his friend. There must have been at least 3 or 4 of these figures. The third one stood over my bed. Although this apparition didn't have any human-like features except maybe the shape of something human, I could still feel that it was staring right at me. I decided then the only course of action was to turn over and face the wall and go to sleep. The morning after, I described my experience to a few of my family members, and they joked that it might be the witches that performed those rituals in the past, and in general just didn't believe me. Except one person, my brother's girlfriend. She told me she had experienced something as well. She was only sleeping next door, and she said that she felt like someone had sat down on the end of her bed in the night, and said that she could feel the weight of someone on her legs, but nothing was there. Very frightened by this, I decided to read the guest book to see if anyone else had reported anything unusual, but nothing of the sort could be found. I'll never forget what I saw that night, and if you're ever up near the Black Isle or stay in the same holiday home I did, just be aware of strange figures entering your room at night. This experience I had dates back to the second house that I lived in. When I was about 13, my nan moved in with us following my granddad's death, and with the sale of the 2 houses, we managed to move into a fairly big house with a massive garden. Just to put it into perspective, our neighbor's garden in a house in a previous time was a small tennis club with 3 courts, and wrapped around the back of our garden, just to give a perspective of the size of these gardens. So anyway, my bedroom was sort of attached, and above the garage to the side of the house, so I used to be able to see across my neighbor's garden and the gardens next door to theirs, whilst also being sort of detached from the rest of the house. We lived there for about 5 years, and nothing really happened. I went to uni and had some experiences which I've posted on another post. When I returned from uni, I picked up the dirty habit of smoking and not wanting my parents to know. I used to climb out of my window on the side of the roof of a shelter that we had outside my window and sit to smoke. When I was back for the summer after my first year, I was on this roof and I heard our neighbor's dog bark and go ballistic. He wasn't in the garden, but obviously by their back door. At the same time, their automatic backlight sensor switched the light on, and clear as day there was a black, and I mean really black, figure in their garden. It stood maybe around 5'10". Looked like a man's figure. It was just pacing up and down their decking, almost right below me. I initially crapped myself, thinking it was the husband and that for sure he had seen me smoking. I looked closer, frozen still. What I was seeing was almost hovering, gliding, effortless, not walking. Suddenly their back door opened, and the husband came out with the dog, and just like that, it vanished. I continued to see Steve out there, and the exact same routine occurred. That was almost every other night. I even kept a log at the time, looking for some sort of pattern. One night shortly after, about 8 weeks, my parents had a barbecue and my neighbors came. I brought this up with the gentleman's wife, who looked at me and laughed. She proceeded to tell me that the shadow's name was Steve. Steve had been in their house for the last 20 years, and she regularly sees him pacing the garden, walking down the stairs, opening and closing doors and cupboards, moving their possessions, almost like living as if they were not there. Her kids had seen him and grown up with him, but her husband had never, ever seen him. I was shook, but glad at the same time that I wasn't going crazy. I continued to see Steve right up until we moved out of the house a few years ago. If anything, I felt sad for him. It was almost as if he was unable to move on.